Thursday, July 1, 1897. The Evening Leader, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Mrs. Nack arrested. Police suspect her of murdering William Guldensuppe. The supposed weapons found. New York's great murder mystery apparently nearing a solution. Legs of the mutilated body found off Brooklyn Navy Yard. Guldensuppe identified. New York, July 1, convinced that identifications of the portions of the man's body found in the East River and beneath Undercliff Avenue at Highbridge revealed the brutal murder of William Guldensuppe, a masseur in the Murray Hill Turkish baths. As stated in 3 dispatches yesterday, the police have arrested Mrs. Augusta Nack, a midwife, at 439 9th Avenue, with whom the man had lived until the latter part of last week. The legs, which had been severed from the lower portion of the body, were found in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where they had been carried by the tide. The legs were done up in a bundle similar to the bundles which contained other parts of the murdered man's body found previously. Identification of the body. The body was identified by the superintendent and employees of the Murray Hill Baths, where Guldensuppe had formerly worked as a rubber. The men who identified the mutilated fragments of humanity were Max Lorne, Adolph Singer, William McPhee, Adam Steubing, James Hand, Frank Gardner, and Michael H. Scully, all of whom had worked with Guldensuppe and daily saw him in a state of nudity, James Flood, the elevator man, and Frank Schellenberg, the superintendent of the Murray Hill Baths. All these men state that there is not the smallest shadow of a doubt that the murdered man was their comrade Guldensuppe. They were familiar with every mark on his body and had noticed a unique deformity. The moment they saw the ghastly remains at the morgue, in spite of the efforts of the murderers to obliterate all distinctive marks, they unanimously and unhesitatingly declared that the body was that of Guldensuppe. They will not admit the smallest possibility of mistake. To complete the work of identification, Dr. J. S. Cosby of 215 West 44th Street, who 3 months ago operated upon the index finger of Guldensuppes' left hand, positively recognized the scar left by his work upon the finger of the corpse. In further corroboration, all the attendants and many patrons of the Murray Hill Baths were familiar with the figure of a woman which had been tattooed on Guldensuppes' breast in the days when he was a sailor. They found the patch of skin cut from the breast of the murdered man exactly to correspond with the place where this tattooing had been. Again, Guldensuppe left the baths at 8 o'clock last Friday morning. He had never previously missed a day's work. There was no known reason for his disappearance then, but from that moment, no trace of him had been found. The woman in the case. Guldensuppe lived at 439 9th Avenue near 34th Street with a Mrs. Augusta Nack, a midwife, who is separated from her husband. She has not seen him since Friday last, when he parted with her after a jealous quarrel. According to Mrs. Nack's first statement, she had found Guldensuppe with another woman's card on Thursday night and quarreled with him about this. He then demanded $50, which she gave him, and he went away. When the murdered man first boarded with Mrs. Nack, her husband lived with her. There was also another lodger who, it is said, held a high place in the woman's affections, but the big masseur supplanted both. The husband left, vowing vengeance against Guldensuppe, and it is said that the other man also fostered a passion for revenge. This man, in February last, drew a pistol on Guldensuppe and tried to kill him, but was overpowered after a hot struggle. The bath attendants noticed that Guldensuppes' body was badly bruised when he went to work the next day. Guldensuppes' associates at the Turkish baths say that the big fellow was implicated in many feminine intrigues and often spoke of women he used to visit in the northern portion of the city, near to the spot where a portion of the body was found. Mrs. Nack under suspicion. Mrs. Nack has been identified as the woman who on Wednesday last purchased some oilcloth of the pattern in which the two parts of the mutilated body were wrapped. The purchase was made in Astoria at the store of Max Reiger at Jackson Avenue and Jane Street. Mrs. Reiger and a customer were in the store at the time, and Mrs. Reiger says that a woman entered and asked hurriedly if she had any table oilcloth. She says that she showed the woman a small roll of the diamond B pattern, and that the stranger took 4.5 yards of this. It is said that she then asked for some white ticking, and that she bought 6 yards of stuff that looked very much like cheesecloth. Mrs. Reiger gave the information to the police, and when Mrs. Nack was taken to police headquarters, Mrs. Reiger was sent for immediately. She came to the city in company with the customer who was in the store at the time of the purchase of the oilcloth, and it was said that both of them positively identified Mrs. Nack as the purchaser. It is known that Mrs. Reiger did. Mrs. Nack was taken by Detectives Price and O'Donoghue to Jefferson Market Police Court from Central Office and was remanded on the charge of suspicion by Magistrate Meade. Mrs. Nack did not seem greatly perturbed. She evidently realized her serious position, but seemed to have remarkable control of herself. She wore a dark dress and a neat hat trimmed with green and white tulle. She was taken back to Central Office, where she will be held until the preliminary hearing. Mrs. Nack denies absolutely any knowledge of the alleged murder of Guldensuppe. She declares that she has seen Guldensuppe after the mutilated remains were found in the river last Saturday. Knife and saw found. The police found in Mrs. Nack's flat a saw and a knife and a pistol, which they took to police headquarters. The police theory, now strongly substantiated, is that Guldensuppe was murdered in that flat and his body cut to pieces there. The knife found has a 10-inch blade. The coroner's physician who examined the stab wound in the apex of the heart, which they say caused death, declared at the time that it must have been made by a knife with a 10-inch blade. Mrs. Nack is a midwife of long experience. She knew some surgery. It is one of the requirements of Germany, her native country, that a midwife shall serve 1.5 years as attendant at operations in some hospital before she can receive a diploma. She has a knowledge of drugs, especially of astringents. From every incision made upon the body she knew what to expect, and could so utilize her knowledge that the flow of blood would be small and stains should not be left. There was a washstand in the room. The oilcloths, which were tacked to the wall behind it, were taken to police headquarters, where they will be microscopically examined for traces of human blood. All the woman's papers were also seized. The flooring was ripped up in the belief that she might have hidden there tools, clothing, or some other evidences of the crime. The saw and knife were found on the second floor of her home, 439 9th Avenue. Both of these were discovered to be stained and bore evidence of an attempt to clear away the stains that were upon them. The stains were not cleared away. The rivets blood-stained. Rivets in the handle of the saw were stained. This saw was ragged, as if it had been broken through some too hard usage. The farther end was cut off short, but in an irregular way, as if it had broken off in meeting a stubborn obstruction. Detectives Price and O'Donoghue found the saw hidden away in a corner. It was covered over with the riffraff and rejected stuff which accumulates in every apartment of the kind. To all appearances it had been thrust there hurriedly after a meager attempt had been made to clean away the stains. It was found after an almost endless search by the detectives for some implement by which the murder might have been done. The tool by which the dismemberment was accomplished, if such it may prove to be, will be a menace to those who committed the awful deed. The detectives all agreed that a tangible and convincing evidence of crime had been brought to light. Later on, a butcher's knife was found. There were stains on it. It is just such a weapon as might have been used in the killing of Guldensuppe, just such a knife as has been predicted to have been the implement used in his murder. The blade is 10 inches in length, the handle 3. Like the saw, it is smeared and stained with marks which look like human blood. The saw and the knife lay upon a table last night in the dining room in the apartments of Mrs. Nack. There the detectives looked at them and pondered over them. The mysterious Fred. A flood of new light has been shed upon the identity of the mysterious Fred, who was rival to Guldensuppe and Mrs. Nack's affections by Anton Burgholzer, a waiter at the Hoffman House roof garden. Burgholzer and his cousin, Peter Burgholzer, were up to May 1 proprietors of a saloon at 441 9th Avenue, next door to the home of Mrs. Nack. They became embarrassed and were forced to give up the business on that date. Their saloon, being so convenient, was frequently patronized by Mrs. Nack and her boarders. Anton Burgholzer got to know them all very well, and therefore when asked whether he remembered the name of Mrs. Nack's other boarder, he replied promptly, "Certainly I remember his name. It was Martin Thorne. I knew him very well, and Guldensuppe too. Thorne went to board with Mrs. Nack sometime last November, or perhaps it would be better to say that he first began coming around our saloon at that time. I liked him very well at first, but when I discovered his quarrelsome disposition, I was inclined to avoid him. Thorne spent a good deal of his time in our saloon. He was fond of playing cards, and one night he got into a terrible fight over a game. I never saw such a man in a fight. He acted like a crazy man, seeming to care nothing at all about his own life. I should say that once aroused, he is a man that would stop at nothing. I do not know the cause of the big row which culminated in Thorne's leaving the house, because after that he did not patronize my saloon any more, and I never learned the full particulars. Some say that Mrs. Nack called Thorne into her sitting room one cold night to sit by the stove with Guldensuppe and herself, and that Guldensuppe resented it. However, it was the next day Guldensuppe, with a black eye and a lacerated cheek, came into my place and said he had had a big fight the night before with Mrs. Nack's boarder. He drew his gun on me, said Guldensuppe, producing the revolver, the nickel mountings of which were stained with blood.